everybody. It is Thursday, September 26th. You're listening to the Mo.news podcast. I'm mo.news.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news, and we read between the lines, so you don't have to. Jill, good to be back in New York. Quick trip down to New Orleans. Had a good session, did an election briefing for a company down there on all things to expect. A little over 5 weeks from today, if you can believe it. A lot of good questions. A po' boy. I did not get to a beignet. It was a very short trip, but got a slight taste of New Orleans in the short time I was there.
Well, that was going to be my first question. What did you eat?
I was
always the most important question.
I was only able to get 2 meals while I was there, so tried to make them count. Good to be back in New York, and especially as there's going to be a lot of travel chaos with Hurricane Helene coming ashore today. And
speaking of travel chaos, you're back in New York City. Stay away from Midtown, East Side, aka the UN. Gridlock. Yes.
We talked about the UNGA for locals. It's just a traffic nightmare with, 100-something world leaders and their security traveling around town, security cordons around hotels. You're like, who's staying here? Who's staying there? Who's in that SUV? Who's in that SUV? A lot of New Yorkers are looking forward to the end of the UN. At least, the UN itself will continue to remain in New York, but the annual UN conference goes a few more days.
All right, time for the headlines. Moshe, we mentioned Helene. The storm has officially reached hurricane status. When and where it is expected to make landfall. It is looking more likely that tens of thousands of dock workers on the East Coast and Gulf ports will go on strike next week. The ripple effects throughout the entire economy. And most, let's just say, bananas and other fruit will be a whole lot tougher to get a hold of.
The strike is bananas, B-N-A-N-A-S.
One of the first words my daughter learned how to spell because of that song.
By the way, I should note my daughter obsessed with bananas. It's the most exciting thing when we walk in a grocery store. She makes her day to see bananas. She loves bananas. But just to return to this story, this actually is a huge story that we will dive into in a little bit.
To politics, the House passes a short-term spending bill to avert a shutdown. But Moshe, I said short-term. So when will be in the shutdown showdown yet again?
Shutdown watch ends for now, Jill. We'll be back on it later this year.
To the Middle East, Israel is preparing for a potential ground invasion of Lebanon. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas set to address the United Nations over the next 2 days. Some bad news for planet Earth. Scientists looked deep beneath what they call the Doomsday Glacier, and what they found spells potential disaster for the planet. But Moshe, would you believe a possible solution? Plastic.
In this case, putting plastic in the ocean might help save us.
Plus, Moshe is on this day in history.
When you're a jet all the way from your first cigarette to your last dying day. That's your clue today.
I'm snapping already.
More on that at the end of this pod.
Okay, let's start with the latest on Hurricane Helene, which officially reached hurricane status yesterday. The storm is forecast to grow more powerful and dangerous before making landfall late today on Florida's Gulf Coast. Forecasts now expect it to become a major Category 4 hurricane, possibly nearing a Category 5 status, and with it, catastrophic storm surge of up to 20 feet. It will head through extremely warm water today, which means that it could grow very quickly. The National Weather Service says more than 42 million people in Florida, Georgia, and Alabama are now under hurricane and tropical storm warnings. In terms of landfall, it is looking, at least as of this recording, like somewhere along the eastern part of the Florida Panhandle, possibly the Big Bend area, again, later today. So that is the curve of Florida's peninsula around the Gulf of Mexico. Rainfall of 8 to 12 inches is also expected. Some areas could get up to 2 feet of rain.
So along the coast there, that is less populous area, but given the size of this storm and the strength of this storm, this will be a problem for a large part of Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and into the Carolinas, Jill. But let's start in Florida here. One forecaster saying Helene could become Tallahassee's worst wind event in recorded history. 100-mile-per-hour winds could be blasting the Florida capital later this evening. It stands toe-to-toe with any of the threats that Florida has faced for a decade now. Down the shore there, down in Tampa, the airport suspended operations early this morning because of the hurricane. Now, Tampa could see up to an 8-foot storm surge and inundation there under current forecast. Mandatory evacuations were already issued. People had to get out yesterday at the latest from Hillsborough County and other places. We heard from a few of you. We heard from a few of you in the mo.news community, who some of whom followed through with this mandatory evacuation. Some of you are staying behind for a variety of reasons. A flood barricade was completed around Tampa General Hospital yesterday to protect the hospital from storm surge. Up in Orlando, the airport there was open late Wednesday, but likely you're not getting in or out of Orlando today, folks. There's also some closures around Disney World and the major tourist venues there. And then the major concern, even beyond Florida, is going to be the inland flooding, some of these saturating storms up to 1 foot to 2 feet of rain. So the nature of these storms, because they're so large, is they're a little unpredictable right now if you're going to get the worst of it or if somehow you only get a couple inches. But Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, all of you will be seeing the impact here of this storm over the course of the next 24 to 36 hours. It'll then head into the Ohio Valley. So Ohio, Indiana, Chicago, Michigan, you'll see the effects of this as well into the weekend. We should note that Helene is the 5th hurricane of the Atlantic season, which is about the average number to date. We thought this was going to be a super record season, but for a variety of reasons, there's been less than was expected. But still, this is a major hurricane. A major hurricane is defined as anything as Category 3 or above, per expectations as we record this late on Wednesday. And that would mean that this is the 5th consecutive year a major hurricane hits the U.S. mainland. That 5 years in a row thing has only happened once before. I heard from someone, Jill, in Florida, who was like, we used to have these types of events in Tampa like once a decade, once every 7 or 8 years. And it feels like the west coast of Florida now is getting one of these nearly every year.
Now to a story that could have ripple effects across the entire U.S. economy and affect everything from grocery prices to the cost of housing materials and car parts. It is looking more and more likely that thousands of dock workers at major ports along the East and Gulf coasts will go on strike on October 1st. The 45,000 workers at the 36 U.S. ports from Maine to Texas are represented by the International Longshoremen's Association. So they collectively handle about half of the nation's imports and exports that come into and go out of the country by sea. The union is looking for an 80% pay raise over 6 years, saying that workers deserve a share of profits that foreign-owned container carriers received during the pandemic. The two sides here have not sat down at the negotiating table since early summer, and most people who are familiar with the talks say that a strike is extremely likely. If that were to happen, it would bring activity at those ports to a standstill, and the ripple effects would be felt shortly after. Experts say one of the big areas impacted would be fruit. For example, about 2/3 of the bananas consumed in America come through these ports, so you could expect to pay higher prices or simply face empty shelves. Grapes, pears, clementines, kiwis, etc. would all be impacted. So because fruit spoils, anything that arrives after October 1st would likely have to be thrown out. And it's not just fruit, of course. We're talking housing supplies, car parts, furniture, all heavily imported through these ports. And then the pain would be felt down the line in terms of truck drivers and warehouse workers. Experts say even a week-long stoppage would cost the economy about $7.5 billion. Other estimates put it at about $5 billion a day. Not to mention, if the strike were to last beyond a couple of weeks, it could run into the holiday shopping season. And Moshe, I hate to bring everything back to politics, but this, of course, comes just about 5 weeks before the presidential election.
Yeah, no, everything right now, well, everything all the time these days feels like politics, but everything right now, especially with just over 5 weeks to go, will have a political impact. The economy, top of mind for voters, when you're talking about cost of living, inflation, overall economy, and notable here because the White House has some power here. Now, the White House says that they are monitoring and assessing potential ways to address the impact on U.S. supply chains here related to operations at ports if necessary. That said, the White House says we can continue to encourage both parties to negotiate and get an agreement that prevents any disruption. But the White House can do more than suggest things to the two sides. There's something called the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, and that allows President Biden to step in here to avert a strike or stop one if it starts. That's what George W. Bush did just over 20 years ago to avoid a work stoppage at West Coast ports back in 2002. Now, the issue for Biden here is that he has called himself the most pro-union president in American history. So union members wouldn't look very kindly on presidential intervention here. And so the White House has not stepped in. But I will note, Jill, that back in 2022, not so long ago, just 2 years ago, Biden did sign legislation that did block a national railroad strike that would have devastated the U.S. economy at $2 billion a day, stranded people. Back then, the Senate overwhelmingly passed legislation along with the House to impose a contract deal on 115,000 union workers when it comes to the railroad. So here you could have Congress and the president step in here. They have not yet done that. Congress doesn't like to act until the last possible second. We know that, and we'll get to that in a second. So the strike here would start just after midnight, early Tuesday morning. And I can't imagine they would let this go on very long, Jill, just given the impact of all of this. JP Morgan, the bank, put out a note saying that the economic impact, this is their quote, would be too big to ignore for political purposes. Before the pandemic, we paid too little attention to supply chain disruptions, but now they appear to be more common. So right now we're watching this. Jill, one of the reasons I was alerted to this, I didn't see that much media coverage of it until this afternoon, is I was hearing from people in the mo.news community who are already working around all of this. They were trying to divert their imports to West Coast ports. And, there's a lot of examples of this. I was talking to somebody in the packaging industry, in the restaurant packaging industry, where they get all of that from abroad. I saw in one report, people who bring in artificial Christmas trees have already been diverting their product to West Coast ports because they don't know how long that's going to last into the fall or what the delays will be. So you've already, if you're working in import-export, this is probably not news to you, but people have already been looking to this for weeks and trying to get in as much supply as they can before this possible stoppage on Tuesday.
And Moshe, I do not want to make light of this story, but usually if I let an obvious Seinfeld reference pass me by, I will hear about it.
The people get mad.
Yes.
You promise it. You said, if I can make a Seinfeld reference, I will. So
okay.
Jill, you have the floor. Yes?
Of course, the made-up job that George came up with for Helene's imaginary boyfriend, Art Vandelay, an importer-exporter. And it got him in a little bit of trouble because Helene couldn't keep track of what he was importing and what he was exporting, blah, blah. Yada. Needless.
So Art Vandelay is going to have some trouble starting on Tuesday, potentially.
Yes, exactly. Yep. If he were a real person. All right, time for the speed read from Politico. Government shutdown watch is over for now. The House approved a bill Wednesday night to prevent a government shutdown, punting a slew of tough spending fights to the end of the year. Translation, we'll be back here in December.
I'll see you then.
Can't wait. Speaker Mike Johnson once again relying heavily on Democrats to pass the measure, which would leave the budgets of federal agencies as is through December 20th. It also provides the Secret Service with it will also provide the embattled Secret Service with an additional $231 million and will allow FEMA's disaster relief fund to scrape by at least through hurricane season. The House passed the so-called continuing resolution in a 341-82 vote. Again, more Democrats voted for it than Republicans. That is something that's becoming a bit typical for Speaker Johnson when faced with getting must-pass spending legislation through the House. A majority of GOP lawmakers did back it, though, with 132 voting for it and 82 opposing it.
Yeah, that's the issue Johnson has as Speaker and has led to some trouble for him, right? And it led to trouble for his predecessors, John Boehner and Paul Ryan and Kevin McCarthy, is sort of that hard right flank of the party that doesn't mind a shutdown, wants the government to shut down, wants to prove a point about spending in the budget. And so to actually get things done, keep things functional, Johnson has had to turn to his colleagues across the aisle there. So Biden will sign the stopgap that'll officially thwart a shutdown that would have kicked in on Tuesday this time around. And that means that they will have 80 days to negotiate a compromise. Now, let's be clear. They're all going to campaign right now because we're 5 weeks till Election Day. So all those House members, they're not getting anything done in between now and Election Day. They'll return at some point in November and take this up again. And that's where you'll find us, Jill, setting the table in November for the negotiations. A lot will depend on who wins, right? Will Republicans take the Senate as is expected? Will Democrats be able to flip the House? Who will be the next president? And then ultimately, they'll want to clear the decks and at least keep the government functional for the next president. That's the argument right now you're hearing from many of them, which is like, let's just keep the funding going how it is right now for a few more months, and then allow the next president and the next Congress to really figure out where to cut and where to spend next year.
Moshe, we mentioned the Secret Service from the Washington Post. Sweeping failures by the Secret Service directly contributed to a gunman's ability to carry out an assassination attempt against the former president at his July 13th rally. This is according to an interim Senate report released on Wednesday. The bipartisan report from the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee pointed to multiple critical failures by the Secret Service, including ones related to planning for the event, communications, and crucial security decisions. The panel accused the Secret Service of failing to clearly lay out responsibilities or plan security. Agency personnel denied to the committee that they were individually responsible or deflected blame, according to the report.
Yeah, so the report here paints a portrait of hapless on-site leadership, unaware of threats, a culture within the agency of individuals unwilling to take responsibility for failures. Even after many hours of testimony, the committee said that no one involved in the rally security plans could say who made the call to exclude from the security perimeter that set of nearby warehouses, one of which the gunman used as a perch. So, Congress here, the Senate, which took up this report, the Senate, which took up this investigation, was frustrated by the fact that they couldn't get answers, even at this point. They're still digging through 2,800 pages of documents right now that they obtained from law enforcement. They're pushing for more interviews for a final report. Again, this is an interim report. But, Jill, what you see listed in this report, and we posted a link on the Instagram account yesterday, because some very concerning details. You had agents who had faulty radios, non-functioning drone detection devices. An agent with only 3 months of training on drone equipment couldn't get his drone to work, and apparently had taken to calling the toll-free number, the tech support hotline for the drone, to troubleshoot it. And apparently that took several hours in the lead up to that rally there in Pennsylvania. So some of the stuff beyond belief, as we talked about it before the podcast, that you're like, non-functioning radios for the Secret Service to protect, someone who is facing lots of threats, just a very troubling report.
Moshe, calling the 1-800 number, doesn't the Secret Service have tech support, you would think, or the government have some sort of tech support?
I think this report and some of what we're learning in the aftermath here is going to lead to, a lot of potential changes there. And Jill, as we noted in the previous story about the government funding, they have put $200 million more towards the Secret Service here to hopefully alleviate some of these situations.
I think also what's really troubling to me is that nobody wants to take responsibility for it. I think that is just such a rot in our culture that people are kind of just placing the blame on others. Own it. I mean, there was obviously at multiple levels failures here. And the fact that nobody is willing to just say, hey, I could have done better, or it's really just sad. I think it speaks to a huge problem in our society at large.
I think there's multiple, aspects of what the acting director, Ronald Rowe, has talked about this in his press conferences. He took over for the previous director, but clearly here, there are multiple levels of reform necessary, right? To the service itself, how they do their protective details, potential funding issues here. But, what's described here is a larger cultural change, and that's going to require, potentially wholesale leadership change and, a fundamental change to how they do their business.
All right, now to the latest in the Middle East from CNN. Israel's military chief told troops Wednesday that its airstrikes in Lebanon were aiming to destroy Hezbollah's infrastructure and to pave the way for a possible ground incursion by Israeli forces. The goal of the incursion is to allow the tens of thousands of Israelis who have been displaced by cross-border fire in the north of the country to return to their homes. It comes as Israel ramped up airstrikes in Lebanon and shot down a missile that Hezbollah said it had aimed at the headquarters of Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, near Tel Aviv, which is the first time that the Iran-backed militant group, Hezbollah, has tried to strike so deeply into Israeli territory.
So the Israelis here have called up a couple of reserve brigades because of the conflict with Hezbollah. The Israeli leadership, including the prime minister, saying they, quote, will not rest until the residents in the north, that's about 80,000 Israelis, can return home after a year of dealing with missile strikes, rocket strikes, and the like. From the north, from Hezbollah. So the Israelis really drastically stepping up their strikes here, potentially looking at a potential ground invasion. The idea is to push Hezbollah off the border. There's a river there that runs through Lebanon called the Litani River. And the idea has always been to keep Hezbollah north of the Litani River because of how close it is to the Israeli border. The Hezbollah terror group right now is south of that, right on the border, and the Israelis want to push them back. And if the current strategy does not, that's why they're looking at a potential ground invasion. It's something the Israelis did back in the war in 2006. It's something the Israelis did in the wars in the 80s, and they're back here again. So as this back and forth has escalated, you're seeing tens of thousands of Lebanese also evacuate cities in the south, cities impacted by the strikes here. And you're seeing a lot of folks at the UN talk about this, hoping for this not to escalate into anything larger. And that includes the U.S., which has spent months trying to negotiate a deal here between the Israelis and Hezbollah to no avail. And so they're doubling down on that before this expands further.
And it comes as both Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas are expected to address the UN this week during the high-level portion of its 79th opening session. Netanyahu is slated to address the UN General Assembly Friday morning, where he is expected to defend Israel's right to secure itself from attacks by Hamas and Hezbollah. And he will likely emphasize that it is, in fact, Iran that is behind funding and supporting both of these groups.
Yeah, and Iran has been calling on nations in the region to support Hezbollah and Hamas, even though Iran has been asked by Hezbollah to do more, and Iran saying, not right now, Hezbollah. We should note that it's not just the Israelis addressing the UN. It's, all the countries around the world have various speaking slots this week and next week. And that will include the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, who will address the body today. And that comes as they've given more recognition to Palestine in the General Assembly. And so he will likely make a push for Palestinian statehood and end to the Israel-Hamas war. Though Abbas, very limited power, he sits there in the West Bank. It's Hamas that runs Gaza. His whole group was pushed out by Hamas more than 17 years ago at this point. And so he's sort of in an awkward situation where he represents the Palestinians, but only partially because of Hamas's rule in Gaza.
Now to some concerning news that we have been following from Antarctica that will likely have an impact on the future of the planet. From CNN, the speed at which the Thwaites Glacier, also known as the Doomsday Glacier, is thawing has scientists warning that its total collapse could happen in the coming decades. The glacier is called Doomsday because of its size, comparable to the size of the UK or the state of Florida. Its disappearance would result in the flooding of millions of communities in low-lying coastal areas around the world. Think Miami, London, New York City. We're talking about 2 feet of water, or 65 centimeters globally. But an even bigger impact is that the glaciers also hold back the entire West Antarctic ice sheet. It could be gone within 150 to 200 years, so by the 23rd century, and could technically happen anytime between now and then. New research from over 100 scientists in the UK and the US tracked for 6 years the speed at which water is flowing into the sea from the Antarctic glaciers, and it found that the glaciers have doubled their loss from the 90s to the 2010s. However, there is some hope because I know that does sound dire. Other researchers are working towards solutions to prevent Thwaites and its neighboring glacier from collapsing.
So the reason why this glacier is so significant, because it acts like a cork holding back that larger Antarctic ice sheet. And that collapse, so you talked about like 2 feet of sea level rise just from the glacier itself, losing that whole Antarctic ice sheet, you're talking about 10 feet of sea level rise. So, devastating situation because about a third of humanity lives just within 10 meters above sea level there in coastal regions. So, you got entire countries like Bangladesh that would have an issue there along with a number of Pacific islands. But getting to the hope here, the idea has been that if the companies of the world can unite here to reduce greenhouse gas emissions sufficiently, that could mitigate the temperature rise, which would then mitigate the glacier's retreat. The question really for these scientists is, you can delay that as much as you want, but is this really just a matter of when and not if this glacier collapses and then the Antarctic ice sheet collapses? So you have other scientists who are working on, well, how can we protect it? Because we can try to depend on humanity to cut down on, to try to cut down on emissions and the like. But what can we do right now? So there are various glaciologists that are working on plans. And Jill, this is the plan that caught our attention. It would be a 50 to 60 mile plastic curtain, effectively, or fiber curtain that would be tethered to concrete foundations in the bottom of the sea. So basically raising a curtain in the sea, 60 miles wide, 2,000 feet from the floor of the ocean, and using that to seal off the glacier from warm waters in the Antarctic current. So less warm water flowing under the glacier, melting the glacier, effectively a cocoon that you can put around the glacier. Again, 60 miles wide, 2,000 feet, the largest shower curtain you have ever heard of. And so what they're looking at right now at the Cambridge University Center for Climate Repair, which I'm learning about right now, is they have a large lab tank where they'll look at the idea, they'll look at water flow and see if this concept would even work. And then they could begin real world experiments within a couple of years. So they would be looking at potentially creating a curtain of sorts for a fjord in Norway and trying it out in the waters up there. And they're seeing if they can do that in the next couple of years here. They anticipate right now the cost of the largest shower curtain in history, or glacier curtain, if you will, is $80 billion. Probably gets more expensive there. But compare that to the trillions of dollars, if not more, that would be needed to protect coastlines, move people, just all of the things you'd have to do around the world if the sea level rose due to the melting here, that this would be, I guess, to use an apt metaphor, a drop in the bucket, Jill.
It is just crazy that we're talking about putting plastic into the ocean as a way to basically save the planet.
Yeah, but it's not like we're just dropping like water bottles and straws here, Jill. It's one large, very large curtain. And it might be made out of fiber. Maybe it's not plastic. I know that's upsetting you.
Yeah, there's something about dropping more plastic and creating more plastic that is upsetting.
Well, we'll talk to the folks at the Cambridge University Center for Climate Repair. Jill has thoughts. Not solutions, but thoughts.
My thoughts, as I think many parents of young girls actually went to Anna and Elsa in Frozen when you said the fjords of Norway. Moshe, you're about 2 years from knowing what I'm talking about.
All right, now time for On This Day in History. We begin in 1957 with our clue. West Side Story, composed by Leonard Bernstein, opened on Broadway. And Jill, fun fact, the film was shot in what would become the future home of Lincoln Center because they'd moved everyone who lived in the neighborhood out. And so they ended up using that as a movie set since nobody lived there. And then they would eventually bulldoze all of that and build what is the modern Lincoln Center in New York City. On this day in 1960, the first in a series of historic televised debates between JFK and then Vice President Richard Nixon was broadcast. Many credit this debate that happened on this day with Kennedy's eventual win. This was the beginning of the age of TV politics. Kennedy looked photogenic, energetic, wore makeup, was well tanned. Nixon had actually recently been hospitalized. He looked pale. He looked ill. He had a 5 o'clock shadow. He didn't shave. And so as the research goes, the people who listened to the debate on the radio thought Nixon won. The people who watched it on TV, estimated to be upwards of 120 million Americans, thought Kennedy won. Sticking with TV history here, on this day in 1964, Gilligan's Island premiered on CBS. And 5 years later, another classic sitcom, The Brady Bunch, premiered on ABC on this day in 1969. And a bit of music history on this day. On this day in 1969, the Beatles release Abbey Road, their last album. On this day in 1984, Prince releases Purple Rain. And I don't know if I put the song up there, Jill, but it's on the list of historic music for today. On this day in 2008, Britney Spears releases Womanizer, Womanizer, I'm a Womanizer.
I think it's You're a Womanizer.
Oh, Jill, you're right. It is You're a Womanizer. Not that would make sense. Why would Britney Spears in this case be a womanizer? But just it goes to show that my knowledge of Britney Spears music, I mean, there's the early songs, the Hit Me Baby One More Time era. When she gets to womanizer, I was an adult. I'm not remembering those lyrics.
Fair enough, Moshe. All right. Thank you all for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
Happy Friday Eve, everybody. We'll see you on Friday, tomorrow.